Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are from. My name is Dr. Brian Edwards, and I'm chair of the Medication Errors Special Interest Group in ISoP, and I'm delighted to facilitate the following two talks for the North American session. Thank you for each of you for being here today and delivering your talk, and we hope that both you and all the attendees today and your families are safe during this as the pandemic with COVID continues. On behalf of the International Society of Pharmacovigilance, we are very pleased to welcome you all to the second day of the ISoP patient safety event. Started yesterday, Thursday, September the 16th, continues today on the September the 17th. As you are all aware, the World Health Organization established the dedicated Patient Safety Day to increase public engagement in healthcare safety and promote global action to prevent and reduce avoidable harm in healthcare. And this year's theme is Safe and Maternal Newborn Care. ISoP strongly supports the actions and intentions of WHO in promoting safe use of medicines. And therefore, we thought it relevant that we cover some important topics in medication safety to promote global action to prevent and reduce medication risk. So I'm glad you want to join these sessions. To start off our event, I am very proud and pleased to introduce our ISoP president, Dr. Mira Harrison-Woolrich, who would like to say a few words to you all. So please listen to her video as this is now played. Thank you.
It's not sounding.
Welcome to this webinar organised by the International Society of Pharmacovigilance for World Patient Safety Day 2021. My name is Mira Harrison-Woolrich and I'm the president of ISoP. Our professional society is a worldwide organisation with several hundred members working in pharmacovigilance. Our aim is to promote the safe use of pharmaceutical products in all countries. World Patient Safety Day was established by the WHO in 2019. And it's marked on the 17th of September each year. It's an important day for ISoP because it promotes patient safety as a global public health priority. Every year, millions of patients die from an adverse event, and many of these are related to pharmaceutical products. This year, with the continuing COVID-19 pandemic, global awareness of medicines and vaccine safety has been extremely high. The everyday work of those of us in pharmacovigilance has made international headlines on a regular basis. ISoP members work in very many different sectors, from drug development, medicines regulation, academia, to pharmaceutical companies. And for all of us, the end point of our work is patient safety. Every issue analysed and discussed is meaningless unless we consider how it impacts on the patient themselves using medicines in their own environment. Drug safety issues also affect the family and friends, including children and carers of patients using medicines. I'd encourage you to think about this broader holistic approach as you watch this webinar today. The WHO theme for World Patient Safety Day this year is maternal and newborn health. So please remember this because it is especially relevant. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you enjoy this webinar that we've made for World Patient Safety Day. We hope you find it interesting and informative. If you work in pharmacovigilance and you'd like to join ISoP, please have a look at our website, isoponline.org, and consider making a membership application. We would welcome you in joining our professional society so we can all work together towards improving patient safety worldwide.
Thank you for your attention for that video, and thank you to Mira for that introduction. I would like to invite all the attendees to show your participation and appreciation of these talks through social media using the hashtags, hashtag ISoPOnline PSD 2021, hashtag ISoP medication safety, hashtag ISoP MEDER, MEDERR, and hashtag World Patient Safety Day, and publish your pictures or ideas about medication safety topics. Without further ado, let me introduce you to Michelle Mandrak, who will be our first speaker today. Michelle is the Director of Consulting Services at the Institute for Safe Medication Practices, ISoP. She is a nurse background and has long experience in medication safety, women's and children's health. She currently manages the ISoP's consulting services, as well as performing medication safety risk assessment and root cause analysis. She frequently participates in the analysis of medication safety issues specific to perinatal pediatric populations. And she developed ISoP's practitioner and residence and international mentorship programs, and has been involved in several of ISoP's safety summits. Since 2002, she's been in the part-time faculty at the Temple University School of Pharmacy, and has 20 years on practice in acute care settings. So she's aware of what it means to be a practicing nurse. So, and today's talk will be addressing common perinatal medication safety risks. So I'd be very pleased to invite Michelle to start her talk. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Let me share my presentation. There we go. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our attendees. It really is an honor and a pleasure to be here with you and to have this opportunity to participate in today's ISoP Patient Safety Day program. There we go. So in our time together today, I'd like to provide an overview of the medication event types in the labor and delivery setting, with a particular focus on oxytocin errors. And then I will also describe ISoP's recent national alert concerning dangerous tranexamic acid errors. And lastly, talk about some safe practice recommendations to address these challenges. So the theme, as we know, for this year's World Patient Safety Day, which is today, September 17th, is safe maternal and newborn care. So let's take a look at how we're doing globally in terms of delivering this care. So recent data indicates that more than 800 women die every day worldwide. This is more than 300,000 deaths related to pregnancy and childbirth each year. And these deaths mostly occur in low resource settings and are largely preventable if appropriate prenatal care is provided. In addition, about 6,700 newborns die every day, amounting about half of all the deaths under age 5, for that year. In Europe and Northern America, 54% of all the deaths under age 5 are in that newborn period. And in addition, 2 million babies are stillborn each year. So certainly very compelling evidence that there is so much work to be done. And as we understand with the COVID-19 pandemic and the disruptions in healthcare services, that's only magnified the maternal and neonatal risks. Now, promoting medication safety in labor and delivery settings is just but one of a number of important considerations in the larger context of providing maternal and newborn safety. Practitioners who work in labor and delivery administer a variety of medications. Many of these are high alert medications, meaning that when they are used in error, they're much more likely to cause patient harm. So medications such as oxytocin, used to induce and augment labor, magnesium sulfate, which is used to treat preeclampsia and delay preterm birth, are frequently administered intravenously. Medications to manage labor pain, morphine, hydromorphone, are also administered intravenously, while others like bupivacaine and fentanyl may be administered by the epidural route. Now, achieving reliability in perinatal care can be challenging. Obstetrical units serve two distinct populations. Most women coming to labor and delivery units are there for a plan of care that involves birth. However, a smaller number of women require care in order to delay birth. So mixing this small population of women who should not be delivering among women who are delivering or who have delivered is done in order to provide care by the staff that have that necessary clinical expertise, but it certainly can create predictable failure points. In addition, oxytocin and magnesium sulfate infusions are often confused with plain solutions or for each other. So inadvertent administration of the wrong medication in these cases sure could cause harm. We have seen tragic outcomes, in fact, the loss of a pregnancy or the delivery of a preterm infant. So the fact too that care in labor and delivery units can be scheduled, it can be spontaneous, it can be in response to a really bad emergency. All of this adds to the complexity. And many of the routine aspects of care are very, very time sensitive. Pain treatment during active labor, as an example, being sure about the administration of antibiotics to manage group B strep prophylaxis, and also the provision of antenatal steroids to promote fetal lung maturity for women who are more likely to require preterm delivery. So what do we know about medication errors in labor and delivery settings? Well, I can tell you we recognize that there's definitely few researchers who have focused on analyzing and publishing medication error data from this clinical specialty. In 2009, in our work with the Pennsylvania Patient Safety Authority, ISoP analyzed medication errors that took place in labor and delivery units in the state of Pennsylvania. Over 2,600 events were reported to the Pennsylvania Patient Safety Reporting Authority, and these data were from June 2004 to April of 2009. Now, the medication error event types associated with labor and delivery, you can see this slide, there's a table that is from that study. The top medication error events were dose omission errors, followed by wrong drug errors. Now, in terms of those that are high harm, overdose and wrong rate were those top event types. So let's look at some of the information concerning dose omission and wrong drug data first. Now, dose omissions, big bucket here, 22% of the overall medication errors in labor and delivery, and nearly 35 of these events were missed doses associated with antibiotics. You may likely understand that antibiotics like penicillin and ampicillin are often utilized in the labor and delivery setting to prevent neonatal group B streptococcus infection. Now, only 11 of the reports specifically detailed group B strep in the report, but it's important as infants are at risk of contracting group B strep infection from infected mothers during labor and birth. And these infections can be life-threatening in terms of sepsis, pneumonia, even perhaps at times meningitis. Group B strep may also cause maternal complications that are not at all related to the neonatal infection. These risks to the mom may occur before or after delivery and certainly have to be treated with antibiotics. So irrespective of what the pathogen is, signs and symptoms of intrauterine infection need to be treated with antibiotics. So obviously this is an important finding that so many of these doses were apparently omitted. On the flip side, I have to tell you that there was relatively low harm profile of these antibiotic dose omissions in this data set. So of the 204 events involving antibiotics that were omitted, no harm scores above D, meaning the error did reach the patient, but it resulted in no harm. And these were even including those events that were specifically tied to group B strep. Now, looking at the reports involving wrong drug errors, nearly 65% reached the patient, and about 4% resulted in harm. In addition, 25% involved high alert medications. And again, these are medications that when used in error are surely much more apt to cause patient harm. And then the majority of the high alert medication events were associated with oxytocin, which we'll talk about. I want to also call out among the wrong drug events in this data set, there were mix-ups between epinephrine and ephedrine. And these error types have also been reported separately to ISoP's medication errors reporting program. So it's these similar names and appearances that have led to these mix-ups between epinephrine and ephedrine ampules and vials. And not only do these drugs look similar, as you can see about their sizes, but their use as vasopressors and vasoconstrictors make their storage near each other much more likely, in addition to their names alphabetically. These products are packaged in 1 milliliter ampules and vials. Also, adrenaline is no longer the recommended international non-proprietary name. So use of the drug name epinephrine is going to add confusion, additionally with ephedrine. Now, these events definitely have caused serious adverse outcomes involving OB patients. So in this particular wrong drug event from the data set, the patient was in labor and the anesthesiologist was in the midst of inserting an epidural catheter. As can happen, the patient's blood pressure dropped and the patient felt dizzy. So the anesthesiologist wanted the patient to receive ephedrine, handed a vial to the nurse who was assisting, and asked the nurse to mix it with saline and give a milliliter of the prepared solution, which the RN did. But then the patient became dizzy, nauseated, and began to hyperventilate. It was then realized that what the RN had been handed was a vial of epinephrine. So the patient was hydrated and then was able to have her symptoms resolve. And they came to find out that there was a vial of epinephrine included in the epidural procedure tray. So that is likely the cause of that mishandoff of the wrong medication. Now, in this event that was reported to ISoP, a healthy young woman in labor became hypotensive after epidural anesthesia. So the nurse notified the OB resident to get orders and inform him of the patient's condition. This resident was known to be difficult and actually was upset. This resident was called out of the OR and gave the order, but sort of snapped at the nurse. And the order was for ephedrine, 10 milligrams to be given IV push. Now the nurse was rattled, felt anxious after that encounter. And so when thinking about the order and moving forward, actually had epinephrine as the medication that she was thinking of. And because there was only a few vials of epinephrine in that labor and delivery setting, she went to the adjacent newborn nursery where she obtained a vial of epinephrine, 30 milliliter vial, 1 milligram per ml concentration, withdrew 10 milliliters, administered it to the patient. Almost immediately, as you would anticipate, the patient became tachycardic and then hypertensive and went into pulmonary edema. Unfortunately, there was an anesthesia staff member right at hand. This patient was rushed in for emergency C-section, and she and the baby did well. Now, on this next slide is another wrong drug event that I really wanted to share because it's also a wrong route of type event. So since 2000, ISoP has described more than a dozen errors that have occurred in the US and the United Kingdom involving the IV administration of epidural bupivacaine in labor and delivery units. And among these events, there's been 5 deaths of young mothers. Most of these fatalities did occur with the IV administration of epidural bupivacaine. And this was before IV lipid emulsion therapy had been recommended as the antidote to treat this kind of a wrong root error. And this was recommended by the American Society for Regional Anesthesia and Pain Medicine. So in this particular error, a 16-year-old came into the hospital in labor, very nervous, wanted to be oriented to, what was going to be happening. And this patient also, during her care, received inadvertently a fentanyl and bupivacaine epidural solution connected to the IV line. And actually what they intended this bag to be was an antibiotic related to group B strep prophylaxis. So within a few minutes, the patient had seizure activity, respiratory distress, and then really went into cardiovascular collapse, which initially was attributed to what they thought was infusing, which was the penicillin. So they did an emergency C-section and delivered a healthy infant, but the team was not able to resuscitate this young mother. And then a few minutes after the resuscitation efforts had been concluded, that's when they saw clearly what was hanging, that it was actually the epidural solution and not the penicillin. The penicillin infusion bag was then subsequently seen as unopened. So very tragic outcome. And this nurse in the United States actually was criminally charged for that event. So now let's take a look at those overdosage errors that I had mentioned. The analysis of this data really focused on these wrong dose overdosage errors because of their correlation with patient harm. So although the reports involving these wrong dose errors that were an overdose of a medication were only about 6% of the overall errors in this data set, 70% of these overdoses reached the patient and nearly 5% resulted in harm. And close to half of these events involved high alert medications. So let's take a look further. On this slide, you can see that the top 5 drugs that were high alert medications involved in these overdoses were oxytocin number 1, and then morphine, magnesium sulfate, hydromorphone, and meperidine. Now, looking further into these reports, these high alert medication overdose events had a strong correlation with failure points involving infusion pumps. 65% specifically mentioned issues with infusion pumps, including pumps that were not programmed correctly, wrong drug, wrong concentrations, wrong infusion rates, and then also events that included free flowing or wide open IVs and IV pump tubing mix-ups. Now, drilling down further into these overdose errors, there were 19 overdoses with oxytocin. And it really is important to note the significant potential for harm for the fetus with oxytocin overdoses. So 9 of the 19 of these errors mentioned the presence of non-reassuring fetal heart rate monitoring. And all of those events also involved an infusion pump, a contributing factor. So we realized that errors with oxytocin are predominantly dose-related and often involve the lack of a timely recognition as well as treatment when there's excessive uterine activity. Improper administration of oxytocin will cause hyperstimulation of the uterus. This in turn can cause fetal distress, possibly the need for a cesarean section. Prolonged could cause uterine rupture or placental abruption. So certainly, pretty significant complications for sure. Fetal effects include fetal hypoxia, and then there could be subsequent brain damage and even death. So sadly, in the literature, there really have been a few of these maternal, fetal, and neonatal deaths reported, and misuse of oxytocin during labor induction or augmentation is really a common malpractice claim. So now I'd like to share with you a recent analysis of errors with oxytocin use. And this was done by ISoP and ISoP Canada and published last year. In October of 2019, ISoP Canada published a multi-incident analysis to identify opportunities for safer use of oxytocin. A total of 144 reports of incidents associated with oxytocin were analyzed from reports that were submitted to ISoP Canada and also to the Canadian National System for Incident Reporting. The reports were from between the years 2000 and 2019. In February of last year, ISoP analyzed an additional 52 reports associated with oxytocin that had come into ISoP's National Errors Reporting Program, and for the same time frame, 1999 to 2019. Now, a quarter of the reports that came in through ISoP, they resulted in maternal, fetal, and newborn harm, while these harms were reported in about 12% of the ISoP Canada reports and 29% of the NSIR reports. So a huge number that were associated with harm. So analysis of the combined data revealed 5 themes, which you'll see here: prescribing errors, look-alike drug packaging and drug names, preparation challenges, administration-associated errors, and communication gaps. So let's take a look at these. Oxytocin errors related to prescribing were associated with selecting the wrong drug from an order entry screen. These errors occurred when the prescriber was searching for the drug name and only using 3 letters like PIT, OXY, and OXY10. Now, most recently, 2 errors were reported in which physicians had entered the letters PIT, looking for Pitocin, the brand name for oxytocin in the order system, but accidentally selecting Pitressin, which is a discontinued brand name for vasopressin, which was still in their systems. Now, this particular example of an error like this occurred when a physician entered Oxy-10 into the order system. Now, the physician was looking to order oral oxycodone 10 milligrams PRN pain for a postpartum patient. But when he entered Oxy-10 into the search field, he inadvertently selected oxytocin 10 units IV, which then created the order oxytocin 10 units IV every 12 hours as needed for pain. So the pharmacist was concerned about this order, but still dispensed it to the nurse because the nurse was waiting for it. The nurse also had asked the pharmacist about this order because she had not ever given a patient IV oxytocin to treat pain. So by the time the pharmacist clarified the order with the prescriber and then updated the system, the patient did receive 1 dose of IV oxytocin. Now, 40% of all the oxytocin-related reports that had come into ISoP, they described lookalike vials that either had led to or could lead to mix-ups between oxytocin and another product. And the most common example in these recent reports involve vials of both generic oxytocin and brand Pitocin 10 unit per mil vials. And these look similar to ondansetron vials that were the 4 milligram per 2 ml size from various manufacturers. And the risk, for this mix-up, is additionally heightened because they could be stored alphabetically and so be near each other, and they're used for the same patient population, especially during cesarean sections. There would be that opportunity. So some of these reports surrounded dispensing errors into automated dispensing cabinets. Now, looking at the errors with lookalike drug names, about 12% of the errors reported describe name confusion between oxytocin and Pitressin, which is amazing because, again, Pitressin is a long discontinued brand name of vasopressin. Now, most of the reported errors involve verbal orders or requests to the pharmacy for Pitressin that were misheard as Pitocin. And then the few errors in which Pitocin infusions were dispensed instead of Pitocin, they definitely resulted in harm in the form of pulmonary edema. So it's amazing, isn't it, that, with a drug name that is no longer in use, still being these systems and contributing to errors. Now, another theme involved the nurse preparation of oxytocin infusions on the patient care unit just before infusion. So nurses would withdraw the volume of oxytocin from a vial, add it to an infusion bag, and then typically administer it intravenously on a pump. Now, when nurses are mixing oxytocin on the unit, there's risk for sterility. There's risk in terms of wrong preparation errors. One of the other issues is if a nurse prepared infusion bag is not labeled well, legibly, correctly, completely, it could be confused with another bag, containing, plain IV solution. So this whole analysis between ISoP Canada and ISoP really did highlight cases where there was incomplete or omitted labeling on these nurse prepared bags that led to safety issues. For example, here, an unlabeled bag of what was presumed to be a plain solution was administered to a patient. And then later, the labor patient was having cramping, and the fetal heart rate began to decelerate. It actually was a situation that progressed so that the patient needed an emergency C-section. They ended up investigating further after the delivery and found out that this bag actually contained oxytocin. So obviously a sentinel event there. Now, there were multiple sub-themes among the administration-associated errors, as you can see here. Infusion pump or IV line mix-ups, infusion bag swaps, infusion rate confusion, and then inadvertent bolus doses from leftover oxytocin remaining in the IV tubing. So we'll talk about some examples, show some more light on these. So mix-up of IV lines and misconnections to the wrong infusion pump have definitely resulted in drug and dose errors as well as omissions. This is one example here to the left. During augmentation of labor, IV oxytocin was to be administered, of course, on a pump at a controlled rate. And it was inadvertently run by gravity. The lactated ringer bag that was also being infused at the same time was supposed to be running by gravity initially as a fluid bolus. So they were mixed up. So then, of course, the patient is getting more oxytocin than intended. And then this event did lead to the need for an emergency C-section. So similar to line mix-ups, we have numerous errors reported in which an oxytocin bag was mixed up with either a plain fluid or with a magnesium infusion bag. So these could definitely lead to significant over and underdoses. Now, what was interesting is there was a common contributing factor that involved the presence of an oxytocin infusion bag that was brought into the room. Its purpose was for after delivery of the placenta. So you could have patients in labor and not on Pitocin, but then this bag was there for administration again after the patient had delivered. So in this example, you'll see that that's exactly what occurred. A nurse selected what was thought to be an infusion bag that was 500 milliliters of lactated ringers, but it was actually oxytocin in the same size bag. So the mother received an unspecified amount of oxytocin prior to delivery at a rate that would have been appropriate for hydration. So this oxytocin bag again had been brought in, for a use after delivery. And then shortly after the, incorrect infusion of oxytocin had begun, the mother's contractions intensified. And then there was a problem with the fetal heart rate monitoring and that the heart rate decreased. So they tried to get this baby delivered as soon as possible. The baby had low APGAR scores at 1 in 5 minutes. And this is an evaluation, it's an assessment done to evaluate the condition of a newborn. And so you can quickly make good decisions about what level of intervention is needed. So this baby did not breathe spontaneously and needed to go to the neonatal intensive care. Another theme was around the terminology used to express an oxytocin infusion rate. These inconsistencies occurred in orders, on the medication administration record, they could be in the pump library, but the concentration of oxytocin infusion is usually expressed in milliunits per milliliter or in units per liter. And then the dose rate, the infusion rate for the solution is expressed as milliunits of oxytocin per minute, and can also be in the volume of solution to be infused to milliliters per hour. But there's definitely, this is part of my clinical background for sure, and I can tell you confusion does exist between these different numbers, and it has an impact in using the wrong number than in programming the pump. And we've had a variety of those kinds of infusion rate type errors. Now, this last example of these infusion administration type events is sure a wake-up call as to how residual medication in the IV tubing can have adverse effects. So in this case, in this IV tubing, there was residual oxytocin. And if the IV lines are not flushed or changed, you could have 10 milliliters or more of uninfused drug left in the tubing. So this event involved oxytocin in a labor patient's line, and the oxytocin was not running, not intended to be running, but when lactated ringer solution was then infused through that same line, there was effectively a bolus of oxytocin that was delivered to the patient that caused hypertonic and tetanic contractions, which are basically excessive, frequent, and prolonged contractions that led to a drop in the fetal heart rate and some fetal hypoxia. So I think that, as a nurse, is just an area of opportunity that's not well understood in practice. And now this last theme in terms of communication gaps, the lack of clear communication. We hear this as so many times involved in medication events. During transitions of care was a key contributor in these oxytocin incidents. So oftentimes, what else was going on was heavy workload, fast-paced environment, at times, new practitioners. So lots of things that, contributed, to the impact of these errors. And then here's an example of one of those communication gaps. In this case, an order was given to hold the administration of oxytocin. There was a deceleration in the fetal heart rate. The oxytocin was turned off. After about 15 minutes, the obstetrician examined the patient, thought the oxytocin could resume, but at a lower rate. Now, a few minutes later, a second physician came on to relieve that original obstetrician, and then gave an order to restart the oxytocin at the original dose. So because there was no documentation regarding the decision to reduce the dose of oxytocin, that was contributory, to a higher dose than intended being administered. And then on these next two slides, we won't have time to talk about them extensively, and these data sets are available on ISoP's website, but let me just highlight some of the strategies to reduce the risk of these oxytocin events, as well as to prevent harm, to maternal, fetal, and neonatal kind of harm. So ISoP recommends having a minimum of 5 letters when searching for a drug name in electronic searches. So hopefully only one drug name is going to appear in the field. To use standard order sets for prescribing oxytocin that really come at it in terms of, all of the practitioners, have worked together to come up with a standardized approach in terms of induction, augmentation, and control of postpartum bleeding. To be sure to have standard concentration and bag size, for oxytocin infusions. to provide patient care units. This is, of course, is a really important one, with ready-to-use IV bags of the oxytocin in standard concentrations, whether from the pharmacy or an outsourced or compounding service, to avoid nurse manipulation of the drug. And then standardize how oxytocin doses, the concentrations and the rates are expressed in orders and in your smart pump drug libraries. And of course, we require the scanning of barcodes on oxytocin vials and infusion bags all along the course prior to preparation, dispensing, and administration. Certainly using smart pump technology with engaged dose reduction systems, and then aiming for bidirectional smart pump interoperability with the electronic health record would also reduce the risk of programming errors. Labeling the tubing on the oxytocin infusion above the injection port and also above the pump, and certainly tracing the lines. So, that's certainly still a manual process. We don't have any great technology solutions for avoiding those line mix-ups. Certainly separating the storage of lookalike oxytocin, Dancitron vials, those lookalikes, cleaning up your order entry systems if you have old names in there, like we saw Pitressin. And when oxytocin is ordered to be discontinued, remove those bags and any unused portion of the infusion. And then lastly, of course, standardized communication at transitions of care. And before I turn it over to Christina, I definitely wanted to bring to your attention some recent cases involving accidental spinal injection of tranexamic acid instead of a local anesthetic that was intended for like spinal or epidural. Mike really wanted me to be able to share this with you. So in 2019, ISoP published about 3 such cases and also published a warning through the National Alert Network. So mix-ups have mostly occurred with vials and ampules of tranexamic acid and either bupivacaine or ropivacaine when selecting the products before regional anesthesia. Now in the US, all 3 of these drugs are in vials with the same blue color plastic cap. So even though the label colors and the vial size may differ, when you're looking down on them, they can be confused, and that's what happened. So tranexamic acid is an antifibrinolytic that prevents breakdown of fibrin. It's trying to promote clotting. But when it's given via the spinal route in error, it's actually a potent neurotoxin that's really harmful to patients with a mortality rate of about 50%. And survivors typically experience permanent neurological injury. Now, to tell you, among these 3 cases that ISoP published, none of them occurred in labor and delivery settings. But in looking at a Medline search that was published in 2019, this was a look at cases between 1960 and 2018. And there were 21 cases of spinal tranexamic acid administration. 7 of these occurred during cesarean sections. Now, these events were in countries outside the US, as 6 of these patients died. So very sobering and very preventable. So on my last slide here are some key recommendations to prevent these kinds of errors. Certainly separating tranexamic acid and avoiding storing it near these local anesthetics is important. Storage conditions to promote being able to read the vial labels, so avoiding storing them standing up, purchasing vials that look alike from different manufacturers, maybe using auxiliary labeling on the vials, certainly using barcode scanning, the opportunity to provide pharmacy prepared or commercially available pre-mixed containers of tranexamic acid would help them look different than the local anesthetic vials. And then lastly, consider NR fit syringes and connectors for these local anesthetics that are going to be given epidurally or spinal route, because these NR fit connectors are incompatible with LOR connectors. So that would help prevent some of these errors where drugs intended for IV use wouldn't be given then into those NorFit connectors. So with that, thank you. And let me turn it back to Dr. Edwards.
Thank you, Michelle. Let me start my video. We do have one question here for you, just quickly.
I'm coming back.
Yep, sorry, as we do have one question, because first of all, I would invite people to put questions in the chat box on the left. We will respond to some of them as our schedule permits. The rest of them will be collected, and a Q&A list will be published on the ISoP website, isoponline.org. So any questions, you could reflect on your Michelle's presentation. Happy to do this. We had a question around the presumed lack of efficacy of medicine like oxytocin leading to overdose to exert necessary effect. Now, this is interesting because I was at the agency, the UK regulatory agency, MCA it was called then, and actually I was asked the assessor to look at the labeling, the SPC, summary product characteristics of oxytocin, to see if dosing instructions could be improved. And at that time, through a consultation, there was such variability in the way oxytocin was being used, we couldn't see a place for regulation or regulated instructions for use as regards to dosing, because it was so dependent on clinical interpretation, which was quite interesting. There's not many medicines which you are actually rather hopeless, if you like, when it comes to recommending the dose. And I mean, I am not aware whether this has been reviewed since, but and of course, part of the issue being oxytocin, the way this is an old medicine, it's been approved, probably not in the traditional way with randomized controlled trials in the past. But still, it's a great, no one's saying it's a great medicine, but still it's interesting, the regulatory situation around it. I just wondered if that's something you've also discussed with FDA, whether they've reached a similar conclusion as well. But also this issue, I mean, this was the issue here that it's not working, and then you just pump some more in, and then you get an overshoot, and then you get an overdose, which, as I say, I remember getting cases like that when I was at the agency. Is that something that's familiar to you at ISoP?
I'm certainly not aware of any recent conversations with the FDA. Now, Chris, is involved in FDA meetings and she may be able to comment on that, but I agree with you that, and perhaps with this recent analysis, there will be that opportunity for discussion. And if Mike were here, he could probably tell us more clearly.
Okay, no problem. I would also like to bring to your attention and the attention of the delegates here in the UK, the MHRA and the National Health Service have set up a consortium for safe use of medicines in pregnancy and lactation. And I had the great privilege on behalf of ISoP to present to the consortium on Wednesday. So I will bring your presentation to their attention. We are in contact with them and actually follow up on some of these comments that you made of the oxytocin, and we can then share it in our regular medication errors meeting, okay?
Oh, that's terrific. Thank you so much.
Okay, the other, for instance, the consortium are coming up through the British Pharmacology Society and the British National Formulary. They will be coming up with better prescribing guides for use of medicines. This will be obviously the consortium. It's not to do with ISoP, but if we can bring this to the attention of ISMP and ISoP, and we can always contact them to see how accessible this new information will be. So just to bring what's going on in the UK to the attention of the wider audience. Excellent. So thank you.
Thank you.
So we now move on to our second speaker, Christina Mekulek. She is a medication safety specialist and administrative coordinator at the ISMP. Chris works collaboratively with health system leaders and clinical staff to define, design, and improve medication safety initiatives, manages the update and analysis of ISMP's targeted medication safety practices, and has been a patient safety analyst to ECRI, the Patient Safety Organization, since 2013, and has a number of roles within the ECRI organization. They're on the expert panel, the Partnership for Patient Safety, Clinical Decision Support, and on the health IT as well. And she represents ISoP on the CEDC and the Prevention of Safe Injection Practices Coalition. And today's talk is on the role of the Medication Safety Officer. And Michael Cohen, the president of the ISoP, was due to give this talk, but he was unable to join us for domestic and personal reasons. And we do send him, on behalf of ISoP, our very best wishes. But never mind, because we know Christina, with that tremendous background, is a great and experienced speaker. So very pleased that you could join us today. So over to you now to listen to your talk on Medication Safety Officer. And the delegates, may I remind you to continue writing your questions in the chat box on the left. Thank you. Christina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Just give me 1 minute to share my screen. Okay. Alrighty. Okay. So I do also apologize that Mike is not able to join everybody today, but I endeavor to present this material just as he would if he were here to deliver it himself. Medication safety responsibility is really vital to the sustainability of healthcare organizations. We know from studies that a hospitalized patient can experience one medication and error a day. We also know that preventable adverse drug events continue to contribute to readmissions, in particular in older adults. We know that the medication safety problem is larger than what we can even glean from medication error reports, because we know from a lot of studies that medication errors are underreported. So for all of these reasons, the medication safety officer has emerged as a really key component in medication safety programs. Today, I'd like to define for you the job of the medication safety officer. I'd like to help identify some key elements of the role of a medication safety officer, and also identify what we believe to be important attributes and qualities of a medication safety officer. What is a medication safety officer? Well, this is a dedicated clinical medication safety advocate. This is somebody that has specialized training, that has practice experience, that's really skilled in patient safety science and reliability, human factors, culture, event investigation. This person serves as the visible authoritative expert in safe medication use. And it's their goal in their role to reduce patient harm from medication errors. We use the term medication safety officer. Sometimes we say MSO, the abbreviation, but people in this role could have a number of different titles. Some organizations like to give this person a director title or put clinical in their title. Coordinator sometimes to sort of emphasize the role that this person plays. Some people may call them a leader. Whatever term people use, they really follow the same role in the organization. Industry positions can support regulatory, adverse event reporting, interaction with healthcare professionals, and also support drug information. So if you're sitting here thinking that, wow, this is one individual that needs to do all this work, How can that be? Well, medication safety really is everyone's job. We all have a role to play in medication safety. However, this person is really that person that's going to lead the efforts. They're going to lead that medication error surveillance, and they're going to be the lead on proactive error control planning for the organization. A medication safety officer can be a pharmacist. In fact, it's very typical to see a pharmacist in this role. However, it doesn't have to be a pharmacist. We've seen organizations that utilize a nurse, a physician. We even know of a physician assistant who serves in this role in the US. Regardless of what practitioner type they are, this person should be somebody that has a strong clinical background. In 2018, ISoP was awarded an US FDA grant for a medication safety self-assessment for high alert medications. And when we analyzed the information that we received through that program, we found that hospitals that had at least a part-time medication safety officer scored significantly higher on the overall ability to safely manage high alert medications. So what this suggested was that hospitals that employed even just a part-time medication safety officer compared to those who had nobody in this role were linked to higher adoption of safer practices. So you might take the leap and recognize that if they were more likely to have safer practices in place, their probability of a preventable adverse drug event is lower. The medication safety officer has a lot of functions in their job. They're the visible champion and the authoritative resource for medication safety. So in this role, you may see these individuals rounding inpatient care areas, talking to practitioners, trying to understand some of the barriers and the systems in place. They're also the information steward and the communicator. This person is the expert on medication safety evidence, information, and knowledge. And as such, you're going to see them taking the lead in researching medication safety, what other organizations are doing, and bringing that back to their own organization. They're also a strategist and an influencer. They are really the voice that establishes medication safety as a core value for the organization, and also helps to have individuals who work in that organization recognize that should be a core value for them as well. They're a cross-discipline team leader. This individual has to work with practitioners across all disciplines and get them united in these medication safety efforts. Typically, we'll see this individual lead a medication safety committee that's a group of multidisciplinary team members. They're also a data optimizer. They're looking at data from the error reporting system. They're looking at data from technology that might be in use. And they're using that data to recognize risk that might be in the system and make recommendations on how to prevent patient harm. And they're also a proactive facilitator. You have to be a facilitator if you're in this role because you're dealing with a lot of different practitioner types and you're trying to affect change. So often these individuals have to be very forward-looking. They have to try and drive the organization to be more prospective in identifying risk, and as such, might even lead multidisciplinary teams to identify failure modes in processes or with new equipment or devices. The attributes of a medication safety officer are varied. This individual has to understand that science of patient safety and reliability. They also have to understand quality improvement principles and human factors. Safety culture is important. They not only have to recognize what a good safety culture looks like, but they have to support it and encourage it in the organization. Typically, they are doing most of the event investigation. And in that process, they have to understand system design and high leverage error reduction strategies. Often after an event, the first response or the easiest response is to offer some education or some training. And that medication safety practitioner recognizes that although that's important, we need higher level strategies as well in order to prevent recurrence of medication errors. I mentioned technology, and there are different technologies that can be in use in organizations, like automated dispensing cabinets or smart infusion pumps, or barcoding to verify medications prior to administration. This medication safety officer needs to understand those technologies and also monitor metrics that those technologies give us to help us identify whether we have risk, and if we do, how much risk we have, so that we can address that to prevent potential patient harm. You also have to be skilled at change management. Nobody likes change, and they're going to deal with a lot of different practitioner types who are very comfortable in the way they may be doing things, but not recognizing that they're setting themselves up for a potential error. This individual also is going to be the one that's going to manage your medication safety dashboard, keeping track of the positive actions that are being taken to prevent medication errors. We think there's also some very personal attributes that really link to a successful medication safety officer. Certainly, the person should be a clinician. They should represent and lead the organization through that multidisciplinary committee that addresses medication safety for the whole organization. They need to be an educator because they're going to be constantly communicating knowledge that they have gained to other practitioners, especially down to the front line. They have to be a facilitator, a good communicator, a negotiator, because it's not always going to go their way the first time that they attempt to change something. I mentioned a change agent. It's really important that this person is visible. Their success will be determined on people recognizing them as a safety leader and believing in the information that they're sharing. They also need to multitask. Now, you could say that for just about any job in healthcare. Being an avid reader of safety literature is important. Information is shared readily. ISoP publishes a newsletter every other week with information about potential medication errors. This person that is being connected to that information is a key component of this person's role. They have to be flexible and, of course, have a good sense of humor. So how do medication safety officers keep things on track? Because they certainly have listed a number of job functions that they typically fill. I think if you asked people that are in this role right now, they probably all would agree that they could use a clone of themselves because there's just so much to do once you get yourself entrenched in some of these topics. Certainly being visible is key. It's not a job that can be done by sitting behind a computer at a desk. It really, you have to be out there, you have to be talking to individuals. I think maybe some of you are familiar with the term, work as designed is not always work as done. And that's where being out and observing can really help understand how work is being done and how it may not be as designed. This person should be there to question policies and observe environmental issues that can contribute to error and any situation that could pose a risk. And also, really important, to encourage reporting, in particular of hazards and near misses, things that we can act upon before they reach a patient and cause harm. And also things that are so much easier to share than talking about an actual event that occurred. This information can be about potential risks can be gathered from outside organizations as well. And typically this person is very connected to the work of ISoP, FDA, Joint Commission. And not to be forgotten, to also be encouraging patients to be active partners in their care. In fact, during some of the rounding, they may speak to patients about medication safety and ensure that they're engaged as well. In 2013, ISoP founded the Medication Safety Officers Society, and we refer to it sometimes by the letters MSOS. This is a society of healthcare professionals, both national and international, that are dedicated to improving medication safety in organizations. And the mission of MSOS is to advance and encourage excellence in medication safety. As an organization, we provide communication, we provide leadership, direction, and education to members. There are two very important benefits of membership, and these are two that are most often utilized by members. The first is a discussion board that members gain access to, where individuals can post challenges that they are having in their own organization or just questions related to medication safety to other like-minded individuals. There's a lot of sharing that goes on through the discussion board. The second most valuable point of membership is the membership briefing webinars. Every other month, this organization holds 1-hour briefing webinars for members only. Those webinars contained 4 10-minute presentations. 3 of them are from members who have initiated a project or sharing a strategy that they put in place at their organization. And the 4th presentation is an update on ISoP activities. If you are listening and you are not a member of MSOS, I encourage you to go to our website and join, because there's no charge, there's no fee for membership. And there are a lot of very good resources, and will keep you connected to other individuals with that medication safety mindset. In 2018, ISoP created a resource document. It is a white paper called The Case for the Medication Safety Officer. This paper describes the necessity that healthcare organizations create some type of centralized leadership role for safety improvement. And then earlier this year, we published a call to action. This was a call to action to organizations to implement a medication safety officer. This concept was actually accomplished several years ago in 2014 in the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, there is a medication safety officer for each hospital trust. And they've been able to realize over the years kingdom-wide changes to support safer medication use. ISoP believes very strongly in supporting medication error education. So we have created several fellowships. Most of these are 1-year-long fellowships, and this really supports the need to have these individuals skilled in safety science. Since the year 1988, when we first started the fellowships, we've had over 50 practitioners go through the program and gain fellowship in ISoP. We do have an international fellowship. We have a shared fellowship with US FDA. If you want to learn more about these fellowships, you can go to the ISoP website. For the FDA fellowship, this fellowship is allows an individual to spend 6 months at US FDA and 6 months at ISoP. There are certain qualifications of the individual, but certainly our fellowships have been very well received. Most of the individuals that have gone through our fellowships are holding some type of medication safety role. On a much smaller scale, if people are interested in either getting into medication safety science, or perhaps they're doing some of this work in their organization and are looking to really improve their skill set, we do have a 2-day program. We call it the Medication Safety Intensive Workshop. And we hold 6 programs a year. They're virtual, so easy to attend. We've had over 1,500 providers attend our programs in the US since 2009. Of those in attendance, 18% were international, and they've come from 16 different countries. We have also held specific medication safety intensives for different countries outside of the US in support of, again, trying to cultivate more of these medication safety practitioners with advanced knowledge to prevent errors from occurring. So that's all I had for everybody today. And I guess we'll call you back in, Brian.
Thank you. And let me switch my video on. That was very good. So thanks, Christina, for your presentation. And thank you, of course, again, Michelle. We've got quite a few questions that have come in. So I will try and go through them, see if we can address some of the points raised. You may be interested to hear that yesterday here in the UK, the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch, with whom you're probably familiar, and that is who investigate healthcare errors, not just with medicines, but the broader National Health Service. They announced that there will be a developing here in the UK course, maybe curriculum, around investigation science. So I think this will be of great interest to the audience here, and certainly it looks like the ISoP want to be in contact. They are setting up an email box to enable communication on this topic. So we will be raising this during our medication error SIG meetings. And they also want to establish the concept of community of practice as well. So this isn't just a UK initiative. I think that we will focus obviously on the National Health Service, but there's learning for everybody, and it's a two-way process, the learning process. Also, there is another investigation agency in Norway, which is also we need to bring to people's attention, and we will do that in future meetings of our medication error group. So now within the medication error group, as you're aware, we have set up a group to look at the medication officer role. And so for some of the questions about low-income countries and the applicability, for instance, of all the tremendous work that you're doing in the US or that's been done in the UK, how that can be implemented in other countries. This is something, well, Mike, and I know yourself, you're involved with, help us here in ISoP. So that's all work in progress. So I just thought that's a bit of background to some of those who asked the great questions, and thank you to everybody who's asking questions. One of them, so let's look at some of these. First of all, how the effectiveness of measures to prevent medication error is measured. How do you measure the effectiveness? Well, of course, that's what we call the $64,000 question, isn't it? And it's a challenge. And as you know, that, for instance, the EMA has recently published good vigilance practices on the assessment of risk minimization measures. It's a challenge around that. And I'm sure that was of interest to you, the use of behavioral science, human factors, techniques. But I just wondered if you and Michelle would like to perhaps comment on measuring the effectiveness of these interventions, because it's understandable that we go to our management and say, look, we need to do these interventions, and they'll turn around and say, yeah, well, let me know what works. So perhaps a few thoughts there.
Yeah, for sure. It is the $100,000 question. But I think from an ISoP standpoint, we think that you could measure medication safety a variety of ways. There are safe practices that you can have on your dashboard. So if you had barcoding as a strategy to prevent errors from reaching a patient prior to administration, a metric that you could use to measure safety would be what percentage of medications are administered with a scan prior to administration. That would be a great dashboard metric. If we want to go to an area without technology, maybe we look at what percentage of patients have an identification band on, and observe whether or not the identification band is used when care is provided. So I think there are a number of ways that you can measure safety that that can show organizations through a dashboard type view where you are on that continuum.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree because it's a lot to be able to convince leaders about the need for certain safe practices, and it's going to be an ongoing conversation. This work will probably never be done, but being able to take a look at what's out there as advocated for high leverage or reduction strategies, and then determining with an interdisciplinary group how you're going to get there, right? You can't maybe have all of the strategies in place at one time, but you can start, if you don't have one, by developing a plan. So what is it that's going to guide your work, this year and into the next couple of years? And then you'd be able to measure your progress. So as Chris saying, you may have some technologies in place, or you may be aiming to implement them, because a number of these technologies in terms of barcoding, whether it's in the pharmacy or prior to administration, or the use of technology that we were talking about earlier in our session today, smart pumps and infusions, and aiming towards the ability down the road to have interoperability, getting these on the radar. But it all begins with taking a look at what's going on in your setting. So doing the work to get an understanding of what is the current state, what do we know? What information is coming in through voluntary reports? Are we getting that kind of communication of hazards, close calls, and errors? And do we have a group that's looking at this and using it as a way to make informed decisions and planning? So in terms of labor and delivery, that's where I would suggest organizations take a look. Like, what do you know? And become informed about the practices, the opportunities. In the incident review by ISoP and ISoP Canada, there's quite a potpourri of safe practice recommendations. Are there opportunities to implement these in your setting if that would be appropriate? Standard order sets is not technology, but it takes group work to make this happen. So there's different ways. Unfortunately, many of them could be process measures, but all of this creates a picture. But starting with the plan and getting a baseline.
And I think there are gap analysis tools out there that can help you. I mean, certainly ISMP has some of them. Michelle mentioned the work by ISMP Canada and ISMP on oxytocin, but there are other gap analysis tools out there. If someone didn't have the bandwidth to be able to do the analysis themselves, all they have to do is really take one of those tools and start to address those statements. We have one at ISMP on perioperative settings, which would sort of fall into the theme of World Patient Safety Day this year, but we also have others, and I know there are others out there as well, but that might help people who might not have the bandwidth to do all of the analysis themselves. This is already compiled as the best practices. Where do you fall? And then that information could be taken to the leaders to say, this is our gap, it's this big, and we need to get it closer.
Sure. I think the high alert medication safety self-assessment that's available, is one other example on the ISoP website. And that, I believe, has 11 sections in terms of different drugs and drug classes. So you wouldn't even have to do the whole assessment. You could focus on opioids. You could focus on medications given by the neuraxial route, or heparin or insulin. Any of these would be huge opportunities to get an understanding of where you are in current practice and opportunities to enhance safety, with the use of those drugs.
Okay, thank you for that. And again, here in the UK, I am aware that they are very strongly looking at SEEPs as SEIPS version 3, which has been developed by Pascal Corain, which you are probably aware of. So that looks very interesting as a tool which could be used across the system by the pharma company, a healthcare trust or hospital, could be clinic, and benchmarking could occur. And it also has the potential for benchmarking across companies. So this is something I am aiming to take forward within our medication error group. So this is, again, there's some really exciting developments. It's getting clearer what sort of tools are usable, and it's up to people, ISoP and ISMP, to try and make them user-friendly throughout the world. And also to collaborate on future training courses. And of course, we mustn't forget the EMA consultation. I think the EMA will publish the comments that were made on the risk minimization measures. So that will be great. We believe next year, Q1 2022, the result of that consultation will be come out. So I recommend everybody look out for that. So I think question 7, we mentioned about formal training on this role when we mentioned about the group. We also mentioned there was a question about should they necessarily have a strong clinical background. Well, I think that's why we have got the medication safety officer group that we started here in ISoP, the sort of different backgrounds. I mean, were you saying clinical? I think we're talking clinical in the broadest sense, in the sense that it's having this medical patient-centered approach is what we're talking about there. When we have, well, any advice for MSOs when they have more than one activity additional to pharmacovigilance, where you said about the multitasking challenge? Well, short of being a Marvel superhero, we don't have any other practical suggestion. No, I mean, seriously, this is, again, part of the way. I mean, I think we have to call this a function. Now, it doesn't have to be necessarily one person. You can talk in terms of the medication safety officer office. So there could be a large organization where you might have to have a medication safety officer team rather than just one individual. So I think perhaps it's best we talk in terms of a function to address how would you say, all those skills and competencies you mentioned, Christina. I don't know whether you have any comments on what I've just said, because the time is, the final question here, how do you keep, this is, you can certainly will have the answer to this, I'm sure, but the healthcare professional, how do you make them aware of medication errors when they're bored, tired, and they're overloaded with information? I've just added that in with visual alerts. I think we've all got information overload. So ISMP, do you have any suggestions for getting people's attention?
I think there's no magic solutions, but I know what works a lot for our organization, and certainly, it's something that I remember better, is when we tell the stories, when we tell the events and the impact and that opportunity to intercept preventable error. Like, people get it, and they want to do their part. But I think just, me showing you, for instance, a bland list of oxytocin safe practices, that's got no excitement to it. And it's just a thing. But when you understand better those real stories behind it, and that opportunity that, if we had, certain practices in place, probably, virtually all of those could have been prevented. And many of them were high harm and had resulted in, some death. So that's what I think is one of the things that people just have to feel really comfortable about telling the story and getting the stories.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly that if Michelle told you that there was a mix-up between ephedrine and epinephrine, it certainly is not as impactful as if it was the story that she told you about how it happened and how it affected the patients. So yeah, for sure, telling stories is a key strategy.
That I think you've raised a very good point there. And speaking to system scientists who know much more about the system analytic techniques, they always say, in fact, the first step is to get the narrative right. What actually happened? And so I think that's perhaps another area for collaboration, this idea of a structured narrative of telling the good story. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, that's a relatively simple thing that can be done, but it's probably underappreciated, and some guidance on how you do that, I think, would be a good idea. In the same way that we've given guidance on the structure of the individual case reports in pharmacovigilance, there should be something comparable for medication errors. And it's often the points that we want to make. Don't you feel that they're often, or believe they often self-evident if you tell the good story about how, before you even have to do any form of systems technique? Mm-hmm. So I just wondered if you wanted to make any further final comments before we close this very interesting session.
I think we're both very pleased to be here with everybody today on World Patient Safety Day. It was really our pleasure, and we're so thankful that you included ISMP as part of it. And we were thankful for the opportunity to be able to share that work that we did in this targeted area of patient safety, World Patient Safety Day 2021.
I agree. I feel like that it is an area that there may be less focus on opportunities. And unfortunately, we're so challenged with the multifactorial variables that relate to success in improving maternal and newborn safety. But there's definitely concrete steps that we can take as we look at, work that these organizations, ISoP, ISoP Canada, the ISoP group, you're mentioning, Brian, groups in the UK, to really be able to coalesce together, so that we can make this easier.
That's right, the so-called community of practice. And this was something that ISoP would be very happy to take part in. And we are very pleased to continue our cooperation with ISMP. So thank you very much, Christina and Michelle, for your contributions today. And for the audience, thank you for your questions. And of course, strongly encourage you, if you want to take part in the Medication Errors Special Interest Group as an ISoP member, please look on the isoponline.org website, where there'll be instructions about joining us. And of course, we have our annual meeting in Oman in November, so we'd be delighted if you could join us then. So thank you. We will now turn to our closing comments. So just to remind everybody, if you want to see this webinar or any webinar of the Patient Safety Day, please go to the ISoP Online Facebook account or YouTube channel. And the plan is that the presentations will appear over the next few days. Okay, so I would now like to say a few closing words. Thanks, Michelle and Christina.